pretty much what is actually my very last segment here on the Ramadan broadcast of News and Views. I am very lucky and privileged to be joined by Professor Erin McCandless. So for those of you who will have caught my introduction at the beginning of every show, of course, I mentioned that I am a researcher affiliated with the Afro-Middle East Center and the Qatar-South Africa Center for Peace and Intercultural Understanding. So I'm proud and very happy to introduce Professor Erin McCandless, Professor of Politics at the University of Johannesburg, and of course the Director of the Qatar-South Africa Center for Peace and Intercultural Understanding. Welcome to the show, Prof. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Absolutely, for me and for us as well. And so the topic for today that we're going to go into directly is, the sort of macabre Justice League, Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, and the Board of Peace that was launched just a few days ago in bizarre circumstances with bizarre aims and bizarre outcomes and the bizarre structure and everything really that embodies the word bizarre. And so, we can kind of start from the beginning. So what is the Board of Peace?
Well, it's fascinating. People have trouble defining it, actually. But in essence, I think it's an enforcement and administrative body really designed to serve Trump's interests, business and power interests, right? But unfortunately, it was approved by the UN Security Council, Resolution 2803, I think, and it has been kind of made official as an international organization as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, how can we make sense of the fact that it was approved by the UN Security Council? Because, of course, Trump is on record as saying that the Board of Peace might actually be an attempt to replace the UN.
Right. Well, I think it was desperation. I think there was such a real need for the Security Council to approve, eventually and finally approve after so many, vetoes on Palestine issue and Gaza issue specifically, that, I think countries just felt that they had to accept something. There was, term limits put into it, and it was meant to be in conversation with the Security Council on a regular basis, reporting to it effectively. But of course, none of that is now made its way into the actual operational design and functioning of the body. So.
Absolutely, and I mean, kind of expanding on that a little bit. What is the mandate that it has?
Yeah, that's very interesting. The charter is very interesting. It actually, you would almost think it's a peace-building organization, right? I mean, just the way that the terminology
it is called the Board of Peace.
It is, and all the right terminology is there in terms of what those of us who work in the field of peace would want to see and utilize. Mm-hmm. In terms of its mandate, but of course the organizational structure and power structures and how they function is not at all like a peace-building organization or anything resembling, what the kind of normative direction of the rules-based order, at least in theory, is meant to be upholding and reflecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And before we kind of go more into its membership and who are its members and what possible motivations they would have had to join, something really interesting that you and I have actually spoken about in a lot of depth is also the fact that it has this very corporate structure. President Donald Trump, part of his appeal during his election campaigns, both this time and in 2016, were the fact that he's a businessman and we should entrust our country to a businessman, and so he's created. It's called the Board of Peace, not a committee, not a council. And so what can we read from that?
I think, unfortunately, this reflects a longer shift within the international community of citizens trusting or thinking that, business leaders should be presidents and have the right training and skill set to do that, which we know is actually not the case. Mm-hmm. But I think the Board of Peace, we can see, we can look at Trump's, this is not new, right? This is meant to focus on Gaza. It's clearly not going to just focus on Gaza, he's already shifted from that mandate. But if we look at his recent successes in Ukraine or DRC, we see this trend of transactional deal making, or what we've called peace for sale, right, where resources are basically being secured for security guarantees. So this is it's a nightmare for those of us who have studied and think about and really focus on how to make and build peace around the world, right? It's the reverse. source of everything we have been focused on and working towards. And clearly societal interests are not at heart, right? So look at the cast of characters who he's put on the board, and heavily business interest reflected, including his own family at great length, right, and his loyals. Business leaders. I mean, there's even an executive committee of the Board of Peace, as if the hierarchical nature of the whole thing is not, readily apparent enough. But then there is an executive committee that's, effectively business leaders and selected countries, Gulf countries. I think Egypt and Qatar are there. But then, his whole team is there, the Marco Rubio, the son-in-law, and so forth. So, I think the biggest problem with the whole thing is that, these are not people who really understand how peacemaking works and what is needed to secure peace. I mean, we have plenty of evidence and international consensus amongst those who actually think about these issues that peace needs to be nationally owned, right? Driven and nationally owned. And that, a political settlement comes before a DDR process, right? A demobilization, disarmament process. It comes before restoring services. So we have this basically, technical administrative committee, which is the Palestinians, where the Palestinians are reflected, right? Who are not political leaders, and they are implementing, effectively what the business interests of the committee and power interests, which are basically seeking to serve the status quo. I mean, Netanyahu is on the Board of Peace. This is
it's a huge irony.
It is a huge irony. I mean, he's a wanted war criminal, right? And we know. So,
yeah, I mean, it seems almost as if Trump is trying to make a family business out of world peace.
Precisely, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and of course, like what you mentioned as well with the technical committee, and that being kind of the only real involvement of actual Palestinians, kind of considering that this kind of emerges from the situation of the genocide in Gaza. Also, I think kind of comes back to a point that I actually made earlier this week with a different guest about how the Palestinian struggle also has this like class component as well, that there are, business elites, and business elites, unfortunately, don't have, they don't have an allegiance or a solidarity to their own people, and only to, their business interests, which relates again to that whole issue of, the peace board having this very kind of like corporate, structure and corporate idea. But you got into very quickly the fact that, Netanyahu is a member of the Peace Board Israel as well. And so there is also this really interesting question of the membership of the Peace Board. So the Palestinian Authority, for example, are not, on the Peace Board. And there are all these other various, different proxies for Palestine, who have joined, for example, the stabilization forces that will be operating in Gaza, and who historically have had, a relatively pro-Palestine, foreign policy agenda, within quotation marks, obviously. What does it say to us that there is no real and serious Palestinian representation on the Peace Board? What does it mean for what can happen in Gaza?
I mean, it's a farce, it's a tragedy, right? It's designed for failure. I mean, let's be frank about it. I think many are scratching their heads and wondering why Arab nations are so involved, but I think that they also felt like, well, they had to be, maybe they can turn this around. This is the only game in town, because the only person who could bring Netanyahu to the table was Trump. Let's be frank, right? So, I mean, it has broader implications for global governance and world peace, obviously, right? It's completely undermining the United Nations. There's no sub-Saharan African member on the board. It's primarily like Gulf states and Morocco and Egypt. I know some people are looking at the BRICS, what was the strategy behind who was invited, in terms of the BRICS. Patrick Bond is thinking about that. I think, we see Putin, we see Netanyahu, we see basically a cast of characters. The majority, most of them actually are ranked as, authoritarian or hybrid political systems on the various democracy indices. So I think it's an incredible threat to how we how we understand the future of global governance and world peace, right? I mean, it's basically undermining, as flawed as it was, and we know it's flawed, right? We know that the rules-based order was seriously flawed, filled with contradictions.
This is a derivative problem.
Exactly. Yet it was, reflecting human nature, right? We have nobody, people are not perfect, but it was at least normatively, theoretically putting in human rights law and other, international law, what the normative direction that we want to go as humanity. This now is just an affront to everything that we have been working towards in terms of trying to bring about world peace and a better world, right?
Yeah, and it's really important that you bring up that, a lot of the countries that are on the peace board are considered effectively autocracies.
Yeah.
And authoritarian states. And I think this has been part of Trump's kind of modus operandi since his first term, which is that he prefers to deal with autocrats. Obviously the most famous case is Putin.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, Narendra Modi in India, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt. And so I think, that's a really interesting kind of angle to look at. And of course, Trump, his most famous, scholarly work is a book titled The Art of the Deal.
Yes.
And and I mean, Trump also has, I think, this sense that, a deal cannot be beneficial for both parties. It can only be beneficial for him, really. And so, it comes to kind of this theoretical question, which I think actually, we've also discussed to some degrees, is having a bad deal better than having no deal? Is having a bad structure better than having no structure?
Yeah.
And I mean, how would you see that? How would you?
No, it's a fascinating question. In fact, I remember it came up at the Doha Forum, at the mediation forum in Doha, where I was speaking recently last year. And I would say, no, a bad deal is worse than no deal. And I think if you put the structures in place in a profoundly asymmetrical, problematic way from the outset, it becomes increasingly difficult to try to transform, fix, change, right? And I mean, with this particular structure, Trump is chairman for life, right? I mean, there's trying to remove him,
even when he's no longer the president of the United States. Yeah. If that happens.
Yeah. So I think starting, it's playing into everything that Israel has wanted, right? And there's no agency or hope for Palestinians. I mean, there's no clear political settlement on the table, right? Once you basically castrate the Palestinians, if they haven't already been, destroyed spiritually, financially, in every possible way, how are they supposed to be able to move towards a genuine political settlement and self-determination, when there has been, a complete hollowing out of the political space for them to craft a way forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, as you kind of, said at the very top of the segment, that, this is also a way for Trump to ensure his business interests as well. And of course, kind of thinking more broadly as well, the kind of business strategic interests of the United States and companies that are, kind of within that circle. The US is very much overtly looking nowadays a bit like an oligarchy, which I think was something that was hidden in the past, but was certainly there.
Yeah.
And Gaza, of course, represents, this territory that and Palestine, generally historic Palestine as well, that the US has and wanted control over for a very long time. Whether that is through through its partnership with Israel or in a more direct way, like what Trump is proposing at the moment through
the Riviera,
the Board of Peace and the Riviera and all of these insipid projects. But you also mentioned, this thing about, Trump's diplomacy being transactional. And so earlier today, in the first hour, we were joined by a guest from Somalia to talk about how the Somaliland government have effectively said to Trump, please recognize us, we'll give you our minerals. And so, is thinking about, the fact that, the Peace Board has this very transactional component to kind of bringing peace, so to speak, peace, if that's what we can call it. What do you think this represents in terms of, trying to solve other, in intractable situations of injustice in the future, and what can that mean for global governance more broadly?
Yeah. No, I mean, as I sort of suggested, it's a complete reversal of everything we've been working towards in terms of trying to foster peace agreements and post-conflict arrangements that deliver outcomes for people, right? And that means, of course, ensuring the mineral wealth of particular countries actually benefits the people of those countries, right? So obviously this plays into much longer term debates around what kind of development and global political economy systems can actually deliver results for societies on the ground. And it's there's no way that this form of transactional deal making is going to support or promote those aims, and I think it's, again, I just think it's rather farcical. Some people say, well, the bad deal, good deal. Well, isn't it better to have $17 billion, pledged so far for Gaza? It's like, well, no, actually 70 billion is needed to reconstruct Gaza. And it's all Muslim countries that have made those donations. Yet it's the West and Netanyahu, that have created this, disaster in the first place. So the bigger irony is that Trump is offered $10 billion, but he's spent 20 in the same period. Since October 7th, 20 billion plus another 10 billion promised on, supporting Israel's war machinery. So it's a completely counterproductive, counterfactual, right? So, I think we're in grave trouble.
And I mean, we've pointed out all of these problems, with the peace board and with this style of I guess, how can we even call it peacemaking, really? But of course, you are a very experienced, person in the field of peacemaking through academia and through your experience as well in international diplomacy. So just before we end, I mean, if you can tell us from your experience, what are the things that are necessary, in order to achieve just outcomes, in situations like in Palestine, for example, or elsewhere where the peace board may eventually hover to?
That is a very tough question to end on. I listened to something yesterday with Dan Smith, former CEO of Cypri, and he said, as peacemakers, we have to be optimistic. Or we're genuinely optimists usually, right? But this is a tough one. I mean, it's. I think in this case, mediation alone is not going to bring results, right? We need social movements. We need the BDS movement. We need, illustrated by South Africa's transformation, and release from apartheid. We need societies to express their voice very loudly and very clearly on this, and to hold their governments accountable, right? I mean, Europe is, making baby steps, small steps, which is great. But the only way we are going to see real change and rescuing of some kind of international law that, or some kind of global social contract that we can all, we're never going to all agree, but some kind of global social contract that retains some integrity and some basis of humanity, is by the world getting involved, everyone being on the right side of history, and everyone isn't, of course, but we need social movements. We need the various types of actors and stakeholders that are rising in different ways, the legal cases that are occurring at subnational levels to global levels, right? We need all of these different tracks of social and political action to somehow forge, towards the right direction, towards a better direction, right? Because we cannot let something like this become normalized. It's totally counterproductive to
absolutely. And there you heard it from Professor Erin. We all have to be involved as well in trying to alleviate, these injustices out there in the world, and not just out there in the world, but over here as well, in South Africa and in the region more generally. And so thank you so much for joining us, Professor Erin McCandless, Director of the Qatar-South Africa Center for Peace and Intercultural Understanding and Professor of Politics at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much.
And with that, we wrap up today's episode of News and Views. It has been an honor and a privilege to be your guest presenter this week. My name is Abdullah Moswis, and of course, just before ending, I have to give a shout out of thanks to the team that put this show together and actually made me look like a competent broadcaster, considering that just 5 days ago I was a complete dilettante. So that's Nasreen, Salailo, Futi, and Abdsalam as well, and Ibrahim. Thank you so much for all of your hard work in putting this together. And just to kind of end very briefly, to summarize a few things from the week, we spoke about what qist means and the necessity of boycotting and being a participant in trying to end injustice out there in the world. The importance as well of intellectual production and research, even going back to our discussion about the Crusades, and the role that, for example, rich Muslims played in setting up awqaf, so that people like Imam al-Ghazali could play a key role in inspiring an intellectual revolution to push people towards wanting to bring change and liberate Jerusalem. And we are still there today. And so I just ask that our listeners think about this in a very kind of deep way, and ponder what role can they play in bringing about a better world this Ramadan and beyond. For the last time this Ramadan, thank you so much. I am Abdullah Mwaswis. This has been News and Views on Salam Media. Have a great weekend, a blessed Ramadan, and may Allah accept our fasts and efforts, all of us. Ameen. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We will end, of course, with a video brought to us by the Africa Muslims Agency. It's #FiredUp. The topic is differentiate between habits and nature, presented by Hafiz Imran Chinara, personal excellence mentor and CEO of the Africa Muslims Agency. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.